Welcome to the More Than English podcast, where we discuss fascinating and influential ideas, learning English along the way. Here we learn more than English.
So let's get started with the case studies that I'm going to use today to give an example of power distance in countries. In this podcast, we take a no-holds-barred approach. And that means that there's no limits, there's no restrictions about what we can talk about. And I'm saying this because the three countries I'm going to talk about are Russia, Israel, and Japan. Well, Japan, it's not very controversial, I guess, but Russia and Israel certainly nowadays are some controversial countries, some controversial topics, but I want to explore these because I think they're very interesting. And like I said, no holds barred. We want to talk about the things that are most interesting and not to leave things out just because maybe they're sensitive topics. So, starting with Russia. Russia is a high power distance country and has a score of 93 on the PDI. Well, I have to say, first of all, I've never been to Russia, I have to admit, but I've had literally 1,000 probably hours of talking with Russians in my job teaching English. So I love to talk to them about many things, including Russian culture. And they have told me that more or less they accept this high score. This is demonstrated firstly by the fact that the largest country in the world by area is centralized into one city, more or less, Moscow. One statistic to back up this information is that 2/3 of all foreign direct investment in Russia goes to Moscow, which makes up 80% of the financial potential in the country. As well as Russia being a centralized country, more or less, we can also say that its organizations are often top-down. That means that, like we said with organizational culture, there's usually a hierarchy and the decisions and the instructions come from the top to the bottom, from the senior director to the manager to the subordinate, something like that. Of course, nowadays in Russia and in Moscow, there's many international companies and many of them have a more modern approach and a more flat organizational structure. But talking about the Russian culture, usually, according to the research and my students as well, there is often a top-down approach. This could also be talking about family and other things as well, right? And while talking to my Russian student, one Russian proverb which stood out to me as something which symbolizes this high power distance quite beautifully is the following. Ty начальник, я далек. Я начальник, ты далек. My Russian pronunciation is probably not very good, but in English this translates to, you're the boss, I'm a fool. I'm the boss, you're a fool. Well, the way I understand this proverb, and maybe you would agree, is that when there is a situation where there is a clear power distance, where there is a clear boss and somebody who is not the boss, this proverb is kind of showing that in Russian culture, it's common that the person who is not the boss has to cater maybe to the boss's needs or to maybe change their behavior to make the boss seem smart or more important than they really are. And when I was thinking about this proverb, I was thinking about a boss who gives an idea about a project. And maybe everybody was already thinking this idea and it was an obvious idea. But because the boss says it, everybody says, wow, what a great idea, right? Whereas maybe in a more low power distance country, somebody else would give the idea first, or maybe the boss would maybe accredit somebody else for the idea rather than claiming it was his own idea. But yeah, this proverb, which I'm not going to repeat in Russian, but you're the boss, I'm a fool, I'm the boss, you're a fool. I think it's a great representation of a high power distance country. Talking about the terms that we mentioned before, let's relate them now to Russia and then to Israel and Japan. And the first one was meritocracy. Well, Russia is known for being quite a nepotistic country, a country which has oligarchs. And in this case, we could say that merit does not take you to the top often in Russia. And this is maybe one reason why it's not a low power distance country. Because not just being good at your job or performing well will make you have a high status or make you rich, but rather it's also the people you know, where you're from, especially if you're in Moscow rather than another city, and many other factors. Linked to this point about meritocracy is the other point I mentioned, which was about government and corruption. And unfortunately, and I guess even many Russians would admit, Russia can be quite a corrupt country. And according to the Corruption Perceptions Index, Russia has a very low score in this aspect, and in 2023 was rated 141st out of all the countries in the world in terms of corruption, one being the least corrupt, and around 180 being the most corrupt. Moving on to Israel, perhaps the most delicate topic in this episode, I was quite surprised to find out that Israel has an extremely low score on the PDI, a score of just 13, which is lower than basically every other country in the world and the majority of even European or, let's say, westernized countries. And I was wondering, how could this be? Is there some kind of mistake? What about the Israel-Palestine conflict and so on? Surely there should be a higher power distance. But then I remembered, the power distance is not about the actual distance in power in a society, but rather the acceptance and expectance of it. So in Israel, although we have to say clearly there are some differences in power between Israeli citizens, given that Gaza and the West Bank are a part of Israel, although occupied mainly by Palestinians, it's still a part of the country. And of course, we have to admit that people living in these areas do not have the same rights as the Israeli Jews in the country. So clearly there's a power distance, but the power distance index has them at only 13. And after some thought, let me try to explain why this could be. So like we said, the power distance index is reflecting the acceptance and expectance of the difference in power. And over many years, we've seen many protests, many conflicts in Israel regarding this problem of power distance or inequality. And this is not just about Palestinians, but even before the Hamas attacks a few months ago, in Tel Aviv and other cities, there were mass protests protesting Netanyahu and the current administration, especially regarding them wanting to make changes to the legal system. So this is an example of, well, you might think, of course, the Palestinians do not accept the power difference, but this is not all, because in Israel, even Jewish Israelis living in Tel Aviv are often protesting and are willing to protest and do not just stand and accept the differences or the problems that they perceive in their own country. Israel is a place where protests are very common. Moreover, it's quite well known that in Israel, there is mandatory military service. Maybe if you're disabled or something, there's an exception, but most people, the high majority of Israelis, must do this. And all of these 18-year-olds in the army, they are all equal. So this also helps foster a sense that there should not be any power distance between them, because at the end of the day, it doesn't matter where you're from or who your parents are. Here, we are all the same.
Maybe you're thinking right now, well, teenagers in Russia also have to spend time in the military. However, while Russia also has mandatory military service, in Israel it's for at least 2 years instead of 1. And in Russia this is only for males, whereas in Israel it's for everyone except Arabs and Palestinians. The other key difference is corruption. Like we said, while Russia scored 141st on the Corruption Perceptions Index last year, Israel scored 33rd. So even if this data is inaccurate, and if Israel is more corrupt than it says here, it's unlikely that they're as corrupt as Russia. And some examples to back up this regarding the military service are as follows. Firstly, evasion through bribery of government officials is more common in Russia to get out of doing this service. Also, it's easier to obtain fraudulent medical certificates in Russia that declare them unfit for service, even if they're not, which often involves bribing medical professionals. Moreover, there are more administrative loopholes in Russia, for example, being registered in certain regions or manipulating residency records. And this relates back to the point about centralization. If you live in a nice district of Moscow, it's very unlikely you will be drafted to do the service. And finally, another key point when we talk about power distance is nepotism. Although all over the world there must be some nepotism, including in Israel, in Russia it's very common, and thus those from rich families very rarely do mandatory military service. And an important note about Israel's very low PDI score before we start talking about Japan. As mentioned in episode 9, Hofstede's research consists of giving questionnaires to IBM employees around the world. In Israel's case, it's highly unlikely that there are many Palestinians living in Israel and working for IBM. The high majority of respondents in Israel are therefore Jewish Israelis, and thus the low score on the PDI shows us principally how Jewish Israelis perceive inequality in Israel and to what extent they accept and expect there to be a difference in power between individuals in their society.
And finally, I want to give the example of Japan. Japan has a PDI score of only 54. And just to give a reference, giving some other examples from Asia, this is quite low because in countries like China, Malaysia, and the Philippines, they have scores of 80, 100, and 94 respectively, which is much, much higher than Japan. And these three countries are among the highest scorers in the power distance index. So why is Japan only 54? Let's find out. Well, like many other Asian countries and other high power distance countries, Japan traditionally and still nowadays in many places has a traditional organizational structure and especially respect for your elders. It's very common in Japan. Like I gave the example about bowing. A young person meeting an old person would be expected to maybe bow lower than the older person to show an added level of respect just because of their age, right? But because Japan is a moderate power distance country or a borderline hierarchical society, there must be some things in this culture which are more low power distance, which makes it even out at around the middle. And a couple of those things, well, the first one, again, is about meritocracy. And that's to say that it doesn't matter if you're born in Tokyo with wealthy parents or born in Aomori, where I used to live. If you work hard in school and if you're smart and if you have what it takes, you can be successful. And even though in Japan, hierarchy and respect for elders and so on, they still believe in meritocracy. And that's something fundamental to the Japanese culture. And one more thing, which is more low power distance, which makes Japan overall around the middle, is the stereotype of Japan that there's a lot of bureaucracy and decisions take a long time. For example, when I lived there, I had to do something in a government building, like sign some documents about my work. Often I would have to go to 3 people to just do one task. Instead of one person being able to do a few different tasks, every person has a specific role, and it's common that if you want to get something done, you might need to speak to 4 or 5 people. All right, so yeah, typically Japan is known as quite a bureaucratic country, and that makes it not quite as high power distance as maybe other places like Russia, because even though there is a hierarchy, the decisions take so long because usually not one person can just make the decision or accept something. So even though the subordinate is not willing to take the decision, it's not that he tells his boss tells his boss, and then his boss says, yeah, no problem, and then it's fine. But rather it goes up the ladder, and then the boss has to kind of ask everybody, and then it has to go down, and everybody has to kind of agree. So although it's hierarchical, it's not quite high power distance because there's not one boss, there's not one guy or a woman who's just making all the decisions. Usually, Japanese culture advocates for social harmony. And that means that instead of one person making all the decisions, they like to agree by consensus, or even if there's one boss that really makes the decision, it's normal that they will ask everybody what they think before finally maybe deciding what they originally thought, or maybe taking the advice of somebody else.
Again, maybe you're thinking, but my country scores highly on the PDI, but it's also very bureaucratic. Well, let me give Russia as an example again, since we've already talked about it. Sorry, Russians. While both Japan and Russia have a lot of bureaucracy, due to a lot of bureaucratic red tape, with administrative processes often being both inefficient and outdated, the difference is, you guessed it, corruption. Corruption often plays a key role in delaying bureaucratic processes in Russia and other high power distance countries. Bribery is often used or even expected in order to speed up processes, creating a barrier for those who do not or cannot engage in such practices.
That concludes this episode, which was talking all about power distance, the first cultural dimension of Gert Hofstede. In the next episode, we're going to talk about the second dimension, which is individualism versus collectivism. But before we finish, what do you think? Are you from any of these countries that I mentioned, like Russia, Israel, Japan, or maybe like Germany I mentioned before? Would you agree with these analyses that I've given? And even if I didn't mention your country, you're free to look at Hofstede's dimensions and look at the score. And please tell me if you agree with that or not. It would be great to know your thoughts. Even if you don't tell me, I recommend that you take a look at Hofstede's website, take a look at some countries, maybe your country versus a country that you've lived in or visited in the past, and just have a look, see what you think. I think it's very useful to learn about not just other countries, but also learn about yourself. And that brings me to the last question. Now that we've studied a bit power distance, what would you say you rate yourself in terms of power distance? How do you see the world personally? Not just regarding your national culture, but your personal culture. How would you rate yourself in terms of power distance? If you tell me, I'll tell you. All right, see you next time.
Let's finish this episode with a quote from Robert Greene, esteemed writer and author of the best-selling book, The 48 Laws of Power. Do not accept the roles that society foists on you. Recreate yourself by forging a new identity, one that commands attention and never bores the audience. Be the master of your own image rather than letting others define it for you. Incorporate dramatic devices into your public gestures and actions. Your power will be enhanced, and your character will seem larger than life. And finally, here's today's key vocabulary. No holds barred, without any limits. To cater, to satisfy someone, especially when their needs are unusual. To accredit, to recognize someone for having done something. Oligarchs, a small group of powerful people who control a nation or industry. To foist, force someone to have or experience something that they do not want. To forge, create or generate something, especially with some difficulty. And lastly, to incorporate, to include something as part of something larger. Thanks guys, see you next time.